I've been driving long haul for about 12 years now, mostly running freight between Phoenix and Denver. You see all kinds of weird stuff out there on the highways, but what happened to me last October still gives me the creeps. I was hauling a load of electronics up through New Mexico on I 25. Nothing unusual about the run. It was one of those perfect autumn nights, clear skies, light traffic, good weather for making time. I'd left Albuquerque around 9 p.m., planning to push through to Colorado Springs by morning. Around midnight, I started noticing this beat-up white pickup truck in my mirrors. At first, I didn't think much of it. Plenty of folks drive through the night on that stretch. But this truck was keeping pace with me, staying about a quarter mile back, never getting closer, never falling behind. I'd speed up to pass slower traffic, and sure enough, the pickup would speed up too. I'd slow down for construction zones, and it would slow down. After about an hour of this, I started getting that uneasy feeling in my gut. I decided to test it. There was a rest area coming up near Santa Fe, so I put on my signal and pulled off. The pickup drove right past without even slowing down. I felt stupid for being paranoid, grabbed a coffee from the vending machine, and got back on the road. But 20 minutes later, there it was again in my mirrors, same distance, same speed. This time I was sure something wasn't right. The highway through northern New Mexico gets pretty desolate, especially past Santa Fe. Miles of nothing but scrub brush and darkness between towns. Perfect place for someone to cause trouble if they wanted to. I tried calling dispatch on the CB, but all I got was static. Cell phone showed no signal. I was completely cut off. That's when the pickup started getting bolder. I crept up closer, maybe 100 yards back now, and I could see there were at least two people in the cab. Then it started flashing its high beams. Long, deliberate flashes, like it was trying to signal me. I ignored it, but the flashing got more insistent. Flash, 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 over and over. I sped up to about 75, hoping to lose them, but they matched my speed easily. The flashing continued for another 10 miles. Finally, I saw lights ahead. A truck stop near Las Vegas, New Mexico. Never been so happy to see a pilot station in my life. I pulled in and parked near the building where there were plenty of lights and other people around. The pickup followed me into the lot but stayed back in the shadows near the diesel pumps. I sat in my cab for a few minutes, trying to figure out what to do. That's when I saw one of them get out. Tall guy, wearing a baseball cap and a dark jacket. He started walking toward my truck, but not directly. He was trying to circle around to my passenger side, staying in the shadows. I fired up the engine and drove around to the front of the building, right under the brightest lights I could find. The guy went back to the pickup, and they pulled up to a parking spot about 50 feet away. They just sat there, watching me. I went inside and told the clerk what was happening. He said they'd had problems before with people following truckers, robbing them at rest stops, or trying to steal cargo. He offered to call the state police, but said it would take at least 30 minutes for anyone to get there. I wasn't about to sit there waiting to become a victim. I had an idea. There were 3 other trucks parked in the lot. all with their engines running, drivers probably sleeping in their sleepers. I walked over and knocked on doors until I found two drivers who were awake. Told them what was happening. These guys, Bob and Martinez, didn't hesitate. They said they'd follow me for a while, make sure I got clear of whatever trouble was brewing. We all pulled out together, my truck in the middle, Bob leading, Martinez behind me. The pickup followed us back onto I-25, but now instead of one truck, they were dealing with three. We stayed in convoy formation for about 50 miles until we reached the Colorado border. That's where the pickup finally gave up. I watched it take an exit and disappear into the night. Bob and Martinez followed me another 20 miles just to be safe. Then we went our separate ways. I never found out what those guys in the pickup wanted, but I've got a pretty good idea it wasn't anything good. Could have been looking to rob me, steal my cargo, or worse. All I know is I was lucky to have other drivers willing to help out. That's one thing about truckers. We look out for each other on the road. We have to. I still drive that route regularly, but I'm a lot more careful now. Always check my mirrors, always have my phone charged, and I never ignore that gut feeling when something doesn't seem right. When I was 19, I took a job working nights at a small truck stop off Highway 83 in Nebraska. It wasn't much, just a gas station with a few parking spots for semis, a little convenience store, and a diner that stayed open 24 hours. The pay wasn't great, but I was saving up for college and needed something that would let me work around my community college classes. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and most nights were pretty quiet. Mostly just long-haul drivers stopping for fuel, coffee, and maybe a quick shower. The truck stop sat about 5 miles outside of town, surrounded by cornfields and not much else. During the day, there was always decent traffic, but at night, especially in the dead of winter, it could get pretty isolated. The nearest house was probably 2 miles down the road, and cell phone service was spotty at best. My manager, Dale, was this older guy who'd been running the place for about 15 years. He gave me one piece of advice when I started. If anything feels wrong, trust your gut and call the sheriff. Better to be safe than sorry. For the first few months, nothing unusual happened. Sure, you get the occasional drunk trucker or someone acting a little strange, but that comes with the territory. Then, in February, things started getting weird. It began with this one driver who would come through about once a week, always between 2 and 3 a.m. He drove an older Peterbilt, dark blue with a white trailer, and he always paid cash for his fuel. Nothing wrong with that. Plenty of drivers pay cash, but this guy was different. He never came inside the store. He'd pump his fuel, then just stand by his truck smoking cigarettes and watching the building. If other customers were around, he'd wait in his cab until they left. When it was just me working alone, he'd stand out there for sometimes an hour, just staring. I started dreading seeing those headlights pull into the lot. The third or fourth time he came through, I was restocking the cooler when I heard the door chime. I looked up, and there he was standing just inside the entrance. Middle-aged guy, maybe 45, with greasy brown hair and clothes that looked like he'd been wearing them for days. He didn't say anything, just stood there looking around the store like he was memorizing the layout. I asked if I could help him, and he just shook his head and walked back outside. That's when I started paying closer attention to what he was doing out there. He wasn't just smoking and waiting. He was walking around the building, looking in windows, checking doors. The diner was closed at night, and there was a back entrance that led to the storage room and the employee break area. One night, I saw him trying the handle on that back door. When he saw me watching through the window, he just smiled and waved like nothing had happened. I told Dale about it the next day, and he said he'd had problems with drivers casing the place before. Sometimes they were looking to rob the cash register. Sometimes they were checking for security cameras or trying to figure out how many people worked there. He installed a couple of extra lights around the building and told me to start keeping the back door locked at all times, even though we'd never bothered with that before. But the guy kept coming back, and his behavior was getting more aggressive. One night in March, he pulled up around 2:30 a.m. like usual, but instead of pumping fuel, he just parked and sat in his cab. I could see him through the windshield, and he was staring directly at me through the store window. This went on for about 20 minutes. No fuel, no purchases, just sitting there watching me. I was starting to get really uncomfortable, so I picked up the phone and pretended to make a call, hoping he'd think I was calling for help. That seemed to work. He started his engine and drove off. But as he was leaving, he rolled down his window and shouted something at me. I couldn't make out the words, but his tone was angry, threatening. The next week, he came back, but this time he wasn't alone. There was another guy in the passenger seat, and they had the same routine. Park, sit, and stare. No fuel, no purchases. After about 30 minutes, they got out of the truck and started walking around the building again, but now they were being more obvious about it, testing doors, looking in windows, pointing at things and talking to each other. That's when I called the sheriff. I told the dispatcher what was happening, and she said they'd send a deputy out to check on things. But we were pretty far out from town, and it would take at least 20 minutes for anyone to get there. By the time the deputy arrived, the truck was gone. The deputy took a report and said he'd increase patrols in the area, but he also told me something that made my blood run cold. There had been 3 truck stop robberies in the past 6 months in surrounding counties. All of them happened at night. All of them involved stores with only one employee working, and in 2 cases, the employee had been seriously hurt. The description of the suspects matched the guys who'd been watching my place. The deputy gave me his direct number and told me to call immediately if I saw them again. They came back 2 nights later. Same truck, same 2 guys, but this time they were bolder. Instead of just parking and staring, they got out and started walking toward the store. I was already on the phone with 911 before they made it to the door. The first guy, the one I'd been seeing for weeks, tried the front door, but I locked it as soon as I saw them coming. He knocked on the glass and started saying something, pointing at the fuel pumps like he wanted to buy gas. I told him through the door that the pumps were prepay only, and he needed to give me money first. He nodded and reached into his jacket, but instead of pulling out a wallet, he pulled out what looked like a knife. That's when I knew I was in serious trouble. I told the 911 dispatcher that the men were armed and trying to get into the building. The second guy went around to the back of the building, while the first one kept trying to get me to open the front door. I could hear the back door rattling as the second guy tried to force it open. Thank God Dale had installed that better lock. I grabbed the baseball bat we kept behind the counter and waited, praying the sheriff would get there in time. The whole thing probably only lasted about 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. Finally, I heard sirens in the distance, and the two guys ran back to their truck and took off. The deputies caught up with them about 5 miles down the highway. Turned out they were wanted for several truck stop robberies across 3 states, just like the deputy had suspected. I finished out my shift that night, but I never felt safe working there again. I put in my 2 weeks' notice and found a different job, one that didn't involve being alone in the middle of nowhere at 3 a.m. I still drive past that truck stop sometimes, and I always think about how different things could have turned out if those deputies had been just a few minutes later. My dad owns a small trucking company in Montana, just him and 3 drivers hauling grain and livestock around the Northwest. I grew up around trucks and started driving with him when I was 16, learning the business from the ground up. By the time I was 25, I was running my own routes and had plans to take over the company someday. I thought I knew everything there was to know about life on the road. I was wrong. This happened 3 years ago, during harvest season. I was driving a load of wheat from eastern Montana to a grain elevator in Spokane, Washington. It's a route I'd done dozens of times, mostly on Highway 2, through some of the most beautiful but isolated country you'll ever see. Miles and miles of rolling wheat fields, small farming towns, and not much else. Cell phone coverage is hit or miss, and if you break down in the wrong spot, you could wait hours before anyone comes along. I left home around 4 a.m., planning to make the delivery by early afternoon and then pick up a return load. The weather was perfect, and I was making good time until I got about 50 miles west of Havre. That's when I started having engine trouble. Nothing dramatic, just a slight loss of power and a warning light on the dashboard. I've been having intermittent problems with the truck for a few weeks, small things that my mechanic couldn't quite pin down. I pulled over at the next rest area to check things out. It was one of those bare-bones stops, just a parking area with a couple of picnic tables and a bathroom, no services or phone. I popped the hood and started looking around, but I'm not much of a mechanic. Everything looked normal to me, so I figured I'd try to make it to the next town and find a shop. I was just closing the hood when I heard another truck pull up behind me. It was an older Kenworth. Looked like it had seen better days with Montana plates. The driver got out and walked over, asking if I needed help. He was a big guy, probably in his 50s, wearing dirty overalls and a baseball cap. Seemed friendly enough, said his name was Earl, and that he'd been driving for 30 years. Earl took a look at my engine and said it looked like a fuel injector problem. Nothing too serious, but something that needed to be fixed soon. He offered to follow me to the next town, said there was a truck repair shop there that did good work. I appreciated the offer, but something about the guy made me uncomfortable. Nothing I could put my finger on, just a feeling. We got back on the highway, with Earl following about 100 yards behind me. The engine problems seemed to be getting worse, and I was losing power on the hills. About 20 miles down the road, Earl started flashing his lights and honking his horn. I looked in my mirrors and saw him pointing to the right, toward an exit that led to what looked like an abandoned rest area. I didn't want to stop in the middle of nowhere with someone I didn't know, so I kept driving. But Earl was getting more insistent, pulling up alongside me and motioning for me to pull over. Finally, he got on the CB radio and said my truck was smoking bad, that I was going to blow my engine if I didn't stop immediately. I looked at my gauges, and sure enough, the temperature was starting to climb. I didn't see any smoke, but Earl was the one with 30 years of experience. Against my better judgment, I took the next exit. It led to what had once been a truck stop, but the building was boarded up and the fuel pumps were gone. Just a big empty parking lot surrounded by trees. Earl pulled up next to me and got out, telling me to shut off the engine before I did any more damage. He popped my hood again and started poking around, making concerned noises about this and that. Then he said he had some tools in his truck that might help, asked me to come take a look at something. That's when every alarm bell in my head started going off. I told him I'd rather just call for a tow truck, but he said we were in a dead zone for cell phones and the nearest town was still 15 miles away. He kept insisting that he could fix the problem, that I should come look at what he was doing. I stayed by my truck and told him I'd rather wait for professional help. That's when his whole demeanor changed. The friendly act dropped, and he got this angry look on his face. He said I was being ungrateful, that he was just trying to help, and that I was making a big mistake. He went back to his truck, but instead of getting tools, he pulled out what looked like a tire iron. Then he started walking back toward me, talking about how city boys like me didn't know how to appreciate help when it was offered. I realized I was in serious trouble. I jumped back into my cab and locked the doors, trying to start the engine. It turned over but wouldn't catch, probably because of whatever was wrong with the fuel system. Earl was banging on my door with a tire iron, yelling about how I wasn't going anywhere until we had a little talk. I kept trying to start the engine, and finally it caught. I threw it in gear and took off, leaving Earl standing there in the parking lot. In my mirrors, I could see him running back to his truck. I pushed my rig as hard as I dared, knowing that if the engine died completely, I'd be trapped. I made it about 10 miles before I saw Earl's headlights catching up behind me. My truck was barely maintaining 45 miles per hour on level ground, and he was gaining fast. There was a small town ahead, just a few buildings and a gas station, but it was better than being stuck on a deserted highway. I pulled into the gas station and started honking my horn, trying to get attention. The station attendant came out, and I told him to call the police, that someone was following me and had threatened me with a weapon. Earl's truck pulled up to the edge of the parking lot, but when he saw the attendant on the phone, he kept driving. The local sheriff arrived about 20 minutes later and took my statement. He said they'd had reports before about someone matching Earl's description, a guy who would target broken-down truckers and rob them. Sometimes he'd offer to help, then demand money for his services. Sometimes he'd just take what he wanted. I never saw Earl again, but I found out later that the sheriff caught up with him the next day. Turned out he had a record for assault and robbery, and he'd been working that stretch of highway for months, preying on drivers who were having trouble. My truck made it to Spokane with the help of some fuel additives the gas station attendant sold me, but I had it thoroughly inspected when I got home. Turned out there was nothing wrong with the engine at all. Someone had put sugar in my fuel tank while I was sleeping at a truck stop the night before. The mechanic said it was an old trick, one that would cause exactly the kind of problems I've been having. I never found out if Earl was the one who sabotaged my truck, or if it was just a coincidence that he happened to be there when I broke down. But I learned a valuable lesson about trusting strangers on the road, no matter how helpful they seem to be. I was 22 and working as a waitress at an all-night diner just off Interstate 80 in Iowa. It wasn't the greatest job, but the tips were decent, especially from the truckers who came through regularly. Most of them were good guys, polite and respectful, and I got to know quite a few of them by name. The diner was one of those classic roadside places, been there since the 1960s, with red vinyl booths and a long counter with stools. We stayed open 24 hours to serve the truckers and late-night travelers. My shift usually ran from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., and I often worked alone after midnight when things slowed down. The cook, Jerry, would leave around 1 a.m., and it would just be me handling the few customers who came in during the dead hours. The owner, Mrs. Patterson, had installed good lighting in the parking lot and a security camera system after some trouble a few years back, so I generally felt safe. Most of the regulars looked out for me. If they saw someone giving me a hard time or acting inappropriate, they'd step in and handle it. There was this unofficial code among the truckers that you didn't mess with the waitresses at the places that treated drivers well. Our diner had clean restrooms, good coffee, and fair prices, so the drivers protected it. But in September, a new guy started coming through regularly, always between 2 and 4 a.m. when I was working alone. He drove a red Peterbilt with Oklahoma plates, and right from the first time he came in, something about him bothered me. He'd sit at the counter instead of in a booth, always choosing the stool closest to the kitchen door, where he could watch me work. He'd order the same thing every time: coffee, a piece of pie, and toast. Nothing wrong with that, but he'd make the meal last for hours, refilling his coffee cup and asking for extra napkins or ketchup, anything to keep me coming over to the counter. And he'd always try to start personal conversations, asking where I lived, if I had a boyfriend, what I did during my days off. I kept things professional, the way Mrs. Patterson had taught me. Friendly, but not too friendly, polite but clear about boundaries. But this guy didn't seem to get the message. He started leaving bigger tips, $20 or $30 for a $5 meal, and he'd make comments about how I deserved nice things and how he could show me a good time if I'd let him. His name was Rick, according to the credit card he sometimes used, and he told me he ran freight between Oklahoma City and Chicago, which would explain why he came through so regularly. He said he'd started timing his trips so he could stop at our diner, that I was the highlight of his route. That kind of talk made me really uncomfortable, but I didn't want to cause problems for the business by being rude to a customer. After a few weeks of this, Rick started getting bolder. He'd lean across the counter when I was wiping it down, getting into my personal space. He touched my hand when I gave him his check, holding on longer than necessary. Once he grabbed my wrist when I was pouring his coffee and said something about how soft my skin was. I pulled away and told him not to touch me, but he just laughed like it was a joke. I talked to Mrs. Patterson about it, and she said she'd speak to him if he came in again. But Rick was smart about it. When Mrs. Patterson was around during the evening hours, he was perfectly polite and respectful. It was only when I was alone that he'd cross the line. She told me to call her at home if he ever made me feel unsafe, but I didn't want to wake her up in the middle of the night unless it was a real emergency. Things came to a head on a rainy Thursday night in October. Rick came in around 3 a.m., and I was the only one in the place. Jerry had already left, and there were no other customers. Rick sat at his usual spot and ordered his usual meal, but this time he was different. More aggressive, more direct. He started talking about how he'd been thinking about me, how he'd like to take me on the road with him, show me the country. He said I was wasting my time in a dead-end job, that I could be living better if I was with someone who knew how to treat a woman right. When I didn't respond positively, he got irritated. He said I was being stuck up, that I thought I was too good for him. He pointed out that he'd been leaving me big tips for weeks, that I owed him some appreciation. The way he said it made it clear he thought those tips entitled him to something more than coffee and pie. I told him I was just trying to do my job and that I'd appreciate it if he'd keep things professional. That's when he got up from his stool and walked around to my side of the counter. He cornered me near the coffee machine and started talking about how lonely it got on the road, how he knew I must get lonely too, working nights by myself. He reached out and touched my face, and I pushed his hand away. He grabbed my wrist, harder this time, and said I needed to stop playing games with him. I told him to let go of me and get back on his side of the counter, but he just tightened his grip and stepped closer. I was getting scared, but I was also getting angry. I told him he needed to leave immediately, or I'd call the police. He laughed and said we both knew I wasn't going to do that I needed his business too much. That's when I realized he'd been planning this, waiting for the right moment when I'd be completely alone and helpless. I yanked my arm free and stepped back, putting my hand on the phone. I told him I was serious about calling the cops, but he just kept advancing. He said all he wanted was a little appreciation for being such a good customer, that I was making it harder than it needed to be. That's when I remembered the baseball bat Mrs. Patterson kept under the register for emergencies. I reached for it, and Rick saw me moving. He lunged forward, trying to grab me before I could get to the bat, but I was faster. I got my hands on it and swung it at him as hard as I could. I caught him in the shoulder, and he stumbled backward, cursing and holding his arm. I raised the bat again and told him to get out of my diner and never come back. He was furious, calling me names and threatening to get me fired, but he was also hurt and apparently not willing to risk getting hit again. He stormed out, slamming the door so hard the bell nearly came off. I locked the door behind him and called Mrs. Patterson, then the police. By the time the sheriff's deputy arrived, Rick was long gone, but I gave them a full description of him and his truck. Mrs. Patterson drove over and stayed with me for the rest of my shift. She was furious that one of her employees had been threatened and said she'd make sure Rick was banned from the diner permanently. She also said she was going to hire a security guard for the overnight hours, at least until we were sure Rick had moved on to a different route. I never saw Rick again, But about a month later, a state trooper stopped by the diner and told us that a trucker matching his description had been arrested in Missouri for assaulting a waitress at another truck stop. Apparently, I wasn't his first victim, and I probably wouldn't have been his last if he hadn't been caught. The whole experience changed how I looked at my job and the customers I served. Most truckers are decent people just trying to make a living, but there are predators out there who see young women working alone as easy targets. I kept working at the diner for another year, but I was never as trusting or naive as I'd been before that night with Rick. Last summer, I was driving from Denver to visit my sister in Portland. I'm 28, been making that drive alone for years without any problems. It's a beautiful route through the Rockies and across Idaho, and I usually enjoy the scenery and the time to think. I drive a Honda Civic, nothing fancy, but reliable and good on gas. The trip usually takes about 12 hours with stops, so I plan it as a 2-day journey with an overnight in Salt Lake City. I left Denver early in the morning, planning to make it to Salt Lake by evening. The drive through Colorado was perfect, clear skies and light traffic. I stopped for lunch in Grand Junction and fuel in Green River, Utah, making good time. But somewhere around Price, Utah, I started noticing a semi-truck that seemed to be keeping pace with me. At first, I didn't think much of it. Truckers and cars often end up traveling together for long stretches when you're going the same speed on the interstate. But this truck was being weird about it. If I'd pass him, he'd speed up and pass me back. If I'd slow down, he'd slow down too. We did this dance for about 50 miles before I started getting uncomfortable. The truck was a blue Freightliner with a white trailer, no company markings that I could see. The driver wore a baseball cap and sunglasses, and every time I looked over at him, he was looking back at me. Not just glancing, but staring. When I'd wave or nod, trying to be friendly, he'd wave back, but something about his attention felt wrong. I decided to test whether he was actually following me. There was a rest area coming up, so I put on my signal and pulled off. The truck kept going, and I felt relieved. Maybe I'd been paranoid. I used the restroom, bought a Coke from the vending machine, and got back on the road. But 20 minutes later, there he was again, pulling up alongside me like he'd been waiting. This time, he was more obvious about watching me. He'd drift over toward my lane, not enough to be dangerous, but enough to get my attention. Then he'd motion for me to roll down my window. I kept my windows up and tried to ignore him, but he was persistent. He'd speed up, get in front of me, then slow down so I'd have to pass him. Then he'd catch up and do it again. This went on for another hour, and I was getting really stressed. I tried changing lanes, taking different routes when the highway split, even pulling off at a gas station, but he followed every move. When I stopped for gas, he parked at the truck pumps and just sat there watching me. I went inside and asked the clerk if there was a back way out of the station, but there wasn't. I was starting to panic. I called my sister and told her what was happening, and she said I should call the police. But I wasn't sure what to tell them. The guy hadn't done anything illegal that I could prove, just driving on the same highway and being creepy. I didn't even have a good description of him or his license plate number. I decided to drive to the busiest, most public place I could find. There was a big truck stop and travel center about 30 miles ahead, one of those places with restaurants, showers, and lots of people around. I figured if I could get there, I'd be safe and maybe I could lose him in the crowd. But as I got closer to the truck stop, the driver started getting more aggressive. He pulled up next to me and was gesturing more frantically, pointing at his CB radio and then at me, like he wanted me to get on the radio and talk to him. When I didn't respond, he started flashing his lights and honking his horn. I was really scared now, but I could see the truck stop ahead. I put on my signal and took the exit, and of course he followed. The parking lot was huge, with separate areas for cars and trucks. I parked right in front of the main building, under the brightest lights I could find, and ran inside. I went straight to the security desk and told him what was happening. The guard, an older guy named Pete, said they dealt with this kind of thing more often than people realized. He said some truckers would target women driving alone, following them and trying to intimidate them into stopping. He walked outside with me and pointed out the blue Freightliner, which was parked in the truck section but positioned so the driver could see my car. Pete said he'd call the state police and have him check the guy out, but it might take a while for them to respond. He suggested I wait inside until the police arrived. I bought dinner and sat in the restaurant where I could see my car, but the truck was still there, and I could see the driver watching the building. After about an hour, a state trooper arrived and went over to talk to the truck driver. I watched through the window as they had what looked like a heated conversation. Finally, the trucker got back in his cab and drove off. The trooper came inside and told me the guy claimed he'd been trying to warn me about a problem with my car, that my tire looked like it was going flat. But the trooper said my car looked fine to him, and the driver's story didn't add up. He'd run the guy's license and registration, and everything checked out, but he'd given the driver a warning about harassment and told him to stay away from me. The trooper suggested I wait another hour before getting back on the road, just to make sure the guy was really gone. I ended up spending the night at a motel near the truck stop instead of continuing to Salt Lake City. I was too shaken up to drive in the dark, and I wanted to be sure the truck driver was long gone before I got back on the highway. The next morning, I made it to Portland without any problems, but the whole experience had really rattled me. My sister said I should have called the police sooner, and she was probably right. But at the time, I wasn't sure if I was overreacting or if the guy was really dangerous. Looking back, I think my instincts were right to be scared. Someone who follows a lone woman for hours on the highway and tries to force interaction isn't just being friendly. I still make that drive to visit my sister, but I'm much more aware of my surroundings now. I keep my phone charged. I make sure someone knows my route and when to expect me, and I don't hesitate to call for help if something feels wrong. The highway can be a lonely, dangerous place for a woman traveling alone, and you can't be too careful. When I turned 30, I've been a long-haul driver for 8 years, usually running refrigerated loads from Seattle down to Los Angeles. I prided myself on knowing every rest area, every way station, and every backroad coffee stop along I-5. But in late November, I learned that familiarity can breed danger just as quickly as it brings comfort. That particular trip started in Tacoma, hauling frozen seafood to San Diego. I planned my usual overnight stops, first at the rest area near Redding, then pushing through to Bakersfield by dawn. The drive down the Siskiyou summit was clear, the kind of crisp autumn air that fogs your windshield just enough to make you think twice before rolling out of a warm cab. I passed Medford around 7 p.m. By 11, I was marveling at how empty 5 was once you get past Mount Shasta. Around midnight, I pulled into the Redding rest area. It's the kind with a few picnic tables, 2 bathrooms, and some vending machines, nothing special. I parked under the lone floodlight, closed the curtains, and tried a nap for a couple of hours. When I woke at 2:30 a.m., I felt the front of my trailer vibrating slightly. Groggy, I opened a side mirror to check, expecting the usual semi-idling next to me. Instead, I saw a dark sedan, maybe a Dodge Charger or something similar, parked parallel with me. Its headlights were off, but the engine was humming. I saw 2 silhouettes inside. At first, I thought someone else grabbing a quick break. No big deal. I yawned, stretched, and flipped on the cab lights. When I glanced back through the rear-facing window, though, the sedan's headlights came on, illuminating the back of my trailer in a single bright sweep. My heart hammered. These rest areas are usually safe. Other drivers look out for each other, and any suspicious activity tends to get reported quickly. But at this hour, I was one of only 2 trucks there. I decided not to wait and see. I hopped in my rig, started the engine, and pulled out of the space. The sedan followed me onto the exit ramp, its headlights glaring high beams in my mirrors. I flicked my high beams in return, trucker protocol for "what's your problem?" But the sedan just slowed down, remaining about 100 yards behind me. By the time I hit Highway 5, I'd move into the right lane, creeping at 55 miles per hour to see if it would pass. It didn't. I radioed dispatch. Dispatch, this is Blue Glacier 27. Got a sedan following me from Redding. Suspect local hell raising. Over. But all I got was silence. Either the channel was dead or someone was listening, but not responding. My cell phone wouldn't work. No signal. My only option was to keep driving. Hope I could rattle this person or find another trucker. At the Ponderosa truck stop, about 20 miles ahead, I made a quick decision to pull over under the bright canopy lights. The sedan glided into the lot a few seconds later and parked against a pillar, engine idling. I kept my engine running, door locked, and did a quick walk around my trailer. No signs of tampering. That's when I spotted the license plate. It was a standard plate from Los Angeles County, but half of the numbers were blacked out. Whoever owned it clearly didn't want to be tracked. I went inside and told the attendant what happened. He was a silvered-haired ex-driver named Hank who said, "Man, you're lucky you pulled in here. Nobody's parked on that side of the lot this late unless they're up to no good." He offered to watch the surveillance monitors, said he'd call local CHP if the sedan moved. Meanwhile, I debated my next move. Should I wait out until sunrise? Should I try to resume driving once I saw the sedan leave? After 20 minutes, the sedan's headlights flicked on, and it peeled out of the lot without pulling in behind any truck. I watched it speed west on I-5 until it was just a dot on the horizon. My relief was immediate. But I also realized I'd lost enough time that my original schedule was shot. I called dispatch again to let them know I'd be late. The attendant, Hank, made me a cup of black coffee and told me to rest a bit before heading back out. I nodded, drained a cup, and walked back to my truck, heart still pounding. I finally rolled out just before 4 a.m. and made it to Bakersfield by sunrise. About a week later, I heard through a driver's group chat that someone matching that Dodge Charger's description had been pulled over near Sacramento for mirror shooting, firing BBs at passing truckers. They had no valid plates, and the occupant ran before cops got there, leaving behind a cracked pipe and a pistol under the seat. Suddenly, my luck in slipping away at Reading felt a whole lot closer than I'd thought. Since then, I double-check my mirrors, keep my rig in gear more often, and avoid lone spot rest areas late at night. That dark sedan taught me complacency will get you killed. I was 18 when I took my first shift as a night attendant at the 40 Petro off-ramp in Amarillo, Texas. Back then, I thought it was a breeze, mostly quiet shifts, just me, the glow of fluorescent bulbs, and the hum of 18-wheelers idling outside. But after a few weeks, I realized boredom and isolation can become a breeding ground for fear. The station itself is a hub for cross-country drivers, but by midnight, half the pumps were empty, and the back lot where the rigs parked felt like a graveyard. In January, Amarillo nights dip well below freezing. One night, I watched steam rise from the grills at a dozen idling trucks, their drivers inside sipping coffee and scrolling on phones. My own smartphone was near dead. When someone came through late, it often meant something was wrong, not just a new customer. It was a Tuesday around 1 a.m. when his headlights first cut across the icy pavement. A dark green Ford F-150 pulled up next to the diesel pumps, and the driver lingered longer than anyone I'd seen before, like he was sizing up the building. I caught a glimpse of him through the glass doors. Mid-40s, scruffy beard, a worn leather jacket that had seen better decades. I smiled politely when he walked in to pay, but he hovered near the door, watching the aisles. He eventually walked to the register and asked for a coffee and a sandwich. Nothing suspicious so far. But then he asked me questions about the layout, like how many exits there were where the back entrance led, and whether the restrooms locked from the inside. I told him we were a one-man operation tonight, pointed to the doors, and tried to keep it casual. He paid, took his bag, and drove off. I watched him pull out, then park at the far end of the lot for a good 15 minutes before leaving. The next week, same truck, same guy. And this time he brought a passenger, another bearded man wearing a hoodie. Together, they circled the building, peering into windows. My gut twisted into knots. I finished stocking shelves, then quietly locked the back door, leading to the employee break room. I also turned the radios in the store to a local AM station playing gospel music. Any sign that someone new was inside would pop out next to the predictable static. By the third visit, I'd had enough. I radio my manager, Mike, a bit of a soft-spoken guy who lived 20 miles away. He sounded half asleep when I told him, "Listen, there's two guys casing the place again. I'm locking up and staying inside until you or someone from the sheriff's office arrives." Mike's side said he'd call around, But with rural Berwyn County, he couldn't promise a quick response. About 10 minutes later, they pulled in again. The passenger jumped out, walked to the front window, and knocked on the glass. My heart hammered. I turned up the gospel station, hoping it masked the radio static. The driver honked once, loud enough to rattle the register. I didn't respond. They circled one more time, then sped off. The engine's rumble echoed down the off-ramp, leaving me huddled behind the counter. A deputy showed up 15 minutes later. He got Mike's call and headed over, trudging through blowing snow. I pointed to tire tracks in the lot leading toward the interstate. He nodded and said, "We had a couple of robberies last month where they hit the register, smashed some video cameras, and grabbed wallets. They never touched the food behind the counter, just the cash. I'll patrol the area double shifts for a while." I thanked him, gave his deputy number, and told him I'd stay locked in until dawn. I finished my shift shaken, counting my tips 3 times over. I gave Mike a heated call the next day. If he wanted me to keep working that job, I needed a security camera upgrade and a silent panic button under the register. He agreed on both counts, but I still left that station 2 weeks later for a daytime retail job. The memory of that scruffy Ford 150 lingering under the streetlights still gives me chills. In the summer before I turned 24, I was driving a rental box truck for a small furniture delivery service out of Salt Lake City. Our routes took us through mountain passes, dusty roads, and sleepy towns in Idaho and Wyoming. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid my rent, and I liked watching the scenery change from desert flats to alpine forests. On a late June evening, I learned that even a box van can feel like a death trap when the wrong person shows up. I was alone on a run from Pocatello down to Ogden, heading back after a full day of deliveries. My shift started at 8 a.m., and by 6 p.m., I had hauled 2 couches, 3 dining tables, and a used mattress. I was tired but proud. Just one more stop, then I'd call it quits and head home. Around 8:30 p.m., I passed through Tremonton when the tachometer needle began climbing. The engine temperature ticked past normal, and steam curled from under the hood. I pulled into a small rest area, just a parking pull-off with a payphone that never worked and a scratchy bulletin board with missing flyers. I popped the hood and peered at the radiator. Nothing obvious, no puddle, no disconnected hose. My phone showed no signal. I sighed, flicked off the ignition, and sat on the running board. I could hear traffic on I-15, but no help was coming any time soon. Minutes later, a beat-up Chevy Silverado rolled in behind me and parked 2 spaces over. The driver, a tall guy in his 50s wearing a cowboy hat, stepped out and said, "You need a hand, kid?" Relief washed over me, and I jumped up. His name was Cliff, and he said he was from Logan, driving home to visit family. I told him I wasn't sure what was wrong, just that the temperature spiked. He popped the hood, squatted down, and poked around. After a moment, he said, "Looks like your water pump's on its last leg. I've got a buddy's barn about 10 miles down. We could tow you with my winch." I told him I prefer a tow truck, but he insisted, "Son, there's no tow services around here past dark." Barn's got a phone and tools. He was right about the isolation, Last service station was 20 miles back in Tremonton. With no bars on my phone, I had little choice. I followed Cliff off the interstate onto a narrow county road, the moon blocked by clouds, headlamps slicing through rolling sagebrush. After 10 minutes, we reached a dilapidated barn that had once been a blacksmith shop, now abandoned except for a battered phone line running to a single rotary phone. Cliff hooked his winch cable to my van's bumper and said, "Let's get you inside." He beckoned me toward the barn's open door. The interior was musty. Boards creaked underfoot, and shafts of moonlight bled through rotted planks. He flipped on a lantern and told me to stay by my van while he checked the pump. A knot formed in my stomach. Something about his grin and that dim light seemed off. I leaned against the side of the barn, went for my pocket knife. Not much defense, but better than nothing. I heard metal scraping behind me. Cliff crawled out from under the hood, brushing grime from his gloves. "Hold on," he said. "I'll get the pump off and clean it up." "Won't take long." Then he disappeared around the front of the engine. 15 minutes drifted by. I sank down next to the door frame, feeling bone-chilled. No more creaking, just silence except for distant crickets. Suddenly, I heard footsteps approaching from the shadows. Cliff emerged, but not with tools. Instead, he wielded a heavy-bodied wrench. "Kid, you owe me for my help," he growled. Panic squeezed my chest. I backed up and pulled my blade, trying to keep distance. He lunged, swinging that wrench sideways. I ducked just in time. The metal cracked against the barn's wooden post. Adrenaline flooded me. I kicked out at his kneecap, staggering him. Then I dove out from under the barn's eaves, sprinting back toward my van. He shouted, "Get back here!" But I leaped into the driver's seat, hurtling the door closed. My hand shook as I turned the key, and miraculously, the engine roared to life. Maybe the van had just been cooling off. I threw it in gear, fishtailed once in the gravel, then shot onto the county road. I didn't slow until I reached Tremonton. There, I called 911 from a payphone. Miracle, it worked. The dispatcher said they'd send units to the barn, but by the time I returned with county sheriff's deputies, Cliff was gone, footprints leading out onto a dirt path towards scrubland. They found the radiator cap lying where I'd opened it. Cliff must have loosened it to force me to stop. I never went back to that route after dark. The van got replaced, the job got shuffled to someone else, and I took a daytime shift around town instead. But every time I pass that barn, my breath catches, knowing I barely got away from someone who wore a cowboy hat and helpful grin. I'm 27 and have been driving a tanker for a regional propane supplier based in Albuquerque for 4 years. In the winter, I run the southern Colorado routes, Durango, Pagosa Springs, and the remote Four Corners region. I faced blizzards, rock slides, and even the occasional runaway elk, but nothing prepared me for what happened one February night on US 160 east of Cortez. I finished a delivery to a remote cabin around 9 p.m. and was headed back along the stretch of highway that cuts through the La Plata Mountains. It's narrow, winding, and usually empty after dark. My radio was tuned to the local station, playing classic country so faint that I could just barely make out calls and fiddle solos. The temperature outside was well below freezing. Frost outlined the tanker's mirrors. About 30 minutes into my return trip, I saw a pair of headlights coming the other way. It looked like a pickup, its beams bright enough to blind oncoming traffic. As it passed, I noticed it was driving way too fast for the icy road. Seconds later, I saw it emerge behind me, lights blazing in my mirrors, almost like it had turned around to follow. I shrugged it off. Maybe they'd realized they missed an exit. But the truck stayed tailing me, hugging the curve onto the same alignment. My gut hardened into something like panic. I tapped the brakes. The pickup did too. I sped up, and it sped up. I tapped the brakes again. It did again. Knowing the tanker's heavy load, I didn't dare swerve on ice, so I endured the tailgating for 10 miles until I saw faint lights of the McPhee overlooked turnout. The turnout had space for 2 rigs, a tiny pull-off with a viewing platform for tourists during daylight. I signaled, slipped onto the turnout, and parked. The pickup skidded in behind me, burying snow under its wheels. I killed the engine, left the cab locked, and watched through my mirrors. The pickup's engine idled. Headlights remained on. After a minute, tall figure, I couldn't see if he was wearing gloves or not, stepped from the pickup. He walked slowly to my driver's side door and knocked, hard enough to make the door vibrate. Inside the cab, I was frozen, heart slamming against my ribs. I pressed on the horn twice, short blast to draw attention. Moments later, the driver's flashlight swept across the side of my tanker, illuminating the propane no smoking placard in stark contrast. He knocked again, more forcefully. I radioed dispatch. Dispatch, this is Silver Flame 3, parked at the McPhee turnout. Got someone pounding on my door. Over. Static crackled. I tried again, no response. The man's silhouette lingered at the window. He tapped the glass twice, pointing at me and making a slicing motion across his throat. My blood ran cold. I reached for my handgun under the seat. Company policy allowed me to carry, as long as it was locked on a mount. The moment I touched it, he stepped back, then sprinted to the passenger side and began pounding on that door. I fumbled with a mounting screw, got the weapon free, and trained the barrel on the tinted window. With the shotgun leveled, I watched as he froze mid-knock. Then he turned, raced back to the pickup, threw a right hook into the driver's door, and peeled out, tires spinning snow. I sat perfectly still for 2 minutes, then killed the lights and let the cab go dark. After 10 more minutes, I started the engine, drove off at 15 miles per hour, and didn't stop until I hit Durango. At every gas station, I stayed under bright canopies, checking shoulder mirrors. That night, dispatch called the state patrol while I was in the company yard, unloading a new load. They found the pickup abandoned 6 miles from the turnout, keys still in the ignition, but no sign of the driver. The truck's license plate had been reported stolen out of Boulder County. Inside the cab, troopers found a half-empty thermos, a ski mask, and a Colt .38 revolver tucked under the passenger seat. Whoever that was, they'd been planning something, probably an attempt to hijack a tanker with thousands of pounds of propane. Since then, I avoid overnight runs on that stretch when it's icy. I've installed dash-mounted cameras, and if I ever feel someone behind me for more than a mile, I drive to the nearest lights. The tanker's horn can't do much in a remote turnout, but a .38 caliber revolver sure can. I'm 29 and have been an over-the-road driver for a national concrete mixer company since I graduated trade school. Most mornings, I'm the first vehicle to roll onto job sites, pouring foundations at construction zones before the sun even rises. But one spring morning, on a job outside Boise, Idaho, I found out that being in an industrial area doesn't guarantee safety when you're off duty. It was mid-March, cool, but starting to feel like spring. I finished a night shift pouring slab for a warehouse outside Nampa and was dropping the mixer back at the company yard just before 6 a.m. My normal route took me along State Highway 19, then on to Interstate 84. I was barely 15 minutes from the yard when I noticed a black SUV tailing me, its headlights far too bright for dawn. At first, I thought maybe a cop, but the vehicle matched my speed exactly mile after mile. I tapped the brakes to let it pass. It hung back for a moment, then mirrored my maneuver like it was waiting. My company radio crackled. Concrete 1 Alpha, where are you? I responded, trying to steady my voice. Alpha here. I have a suspicious SUV following me from sight. I'm heading en route 19, ETA a few minutes. Back came, stay calm, keep us posted. I flipped the warning lights on and slowed to 25 mph. The SUV remained behind, hood reflecting the mixer's drum. At a stop sign in Cuna, I pulled to the right edge and idled. The SUV stopped 2 car lengths behind. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. I couldn't see his face clearly, but he wore a full-brim hat and beat-up work boots. He began walking toward my cab with his hands stuffed into his hoodie pockets. My heart pumped so hard it rattled my seatbelt. I reached for my phone, still no signal. I hopped out of the truck and jogged to the back where a toolbox sat strapped to the chassis. My company-issued tire iron was inside. With it in hand, I circled around the left side of the mixer, but when I reached the driver's door, the man was gone. I hurried back to the front, and that's when I saw him crouching near the front passenger tire, trying to loosen a lug nut. I snarled, "Hey, get away from my truck." He froze, looked up, and smiled, showing a gold tooth that glinted in the early sun. "Morning, buddy," he said. "Thought I'd help you out. Did your tire look a little low?" My pulse spiked. I said, "Don't you touch my wheels. I got records that follow this truck every minute. Security cameras, GPS, you'll get caught." His grin widened. He replied, "Maybe, maybe not." I edged backward, keeping the tire iron ready. Then from behind me, I heard a rumble. My company's supervisor, Jeremy, rolling onto the job site in a white pickup truck. Jeremy had circled back when he heard my radio call. The would-be tire slasher saw Jeremy's truck approaching and bolted, dashed past my cab, running east across the lot toward the highway. I called out Jeremy's name, waving, but the man slipped behind a stack of lumber crates and vanished before Jeremy could get a bead on him. Jeremy sped up next to me and jumped out. "Holy, did he try to slash your tire?" I nodded, breathing hard. He radioed dispatch to send cops to the site. Meanwhile, we walked the perimeter of the work lot, behind the storage containers under scaffolding, but found no sign of the stranger. A local deputy arrived 20 minutes later, took our statements, and dusted for fingerprints on the lug nuts and dirt around a tire. But no prints. Either it snowed a bit overnight and they wiped away, or he wore gloves. Dispatch later told me that a string of thefts had targeted construction equipment around the Treasure Valley. Thieves would puncture tires, strand a vehicle, then come back with tools to strip parts, catalytic converters, wiring harnesses, even hydraulic pumps. Someone must have assumed I kept salvageable parts in that toolbox. But by walking up on him, I likely saved the mixer from losing thousands of dollars in parts and repairs. That afternoon, I drove home on a different route, a longer back road through Cuna's farmland, just in case. I never found out who he was, though a coworker mentioned someone saw a black SUV matching that model cruising around job sites for weeks. Now, before leaving any work site, I do a complete walk around. Tires, fluid caps, everything. I keep a small spotlight in my cab, too. Shine it under the chassis and behind wheels if I ever feel like I'm being followed. Ever since, I don't assume a construction yard is safe at dawn. Complacency on the clock can make you an easy target. Someone sees you get tired, sees a mixer idling, and thinks, that's easy money. But gasoline in the tank and steel in the drum isn't worth losing your livelihood. If he ever shows up again, I'll have a camera trained on him and maybe a .38 in my glove box just in case.